Lincoln is supported by the local venues with listings included here. Here's live music happening this week in Lincoln. On Saturday, February 2nd, Orphan John and the Abandoned play the Zoo Bar at 5 p.m., followed by Daniel and the Deliverance with Hanson Airship at 9 p.m., and Randall King with Kylie Frey play the Bourbon Theater at 8. And that's live music happening this week in Lincoln.
You're listening to KZUM News on 89.3 KZUM Lincoln and KZUM HD. Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of KZUM News, an hour dedicated to learning more about what is going on in Lincoln and the surrounding areas. I am the news director and your host, Amantha Dickman.
I am calling loudly today for a ceasefire, with a poem dedicated to them and hopefully calling them into this struggle. I want to show my father the faces of the KZUM dead. Tell him, if anyone murdered you in this way, I would burn down the world, I would gamble my soul, I would launch every rocket, throw every stone, fight every force to avenge you, because I am your daughter. Like Julie Ramez Al-Suri was the daughter of a father whose grief will shackle him to the floor of every church he enters because his daughter at 12 years old died in the church where she sheltered. Julie shares my sister's name, and in some small way is also your daughter, via language and empathy. My sister Julie, your daughter Julie, had braces at 12 years old. She wore a woven choker and dyed green tips at the end of her long hair. Julie Ramez Al-Suri will never go to an orthodontist. She will never wear tacky preteen jewelry. She will never bleach her tumbling locks. She will never call her dad at the end of the day. He will miss her the very same way that we would miss ours. Our very own Julie, our soft Jewish Julie, our beautiful Julie, warm and alive. Ceasefire now. Thank you so much.
What you just heard was a clip from the Wednesday, January 31st press conference hosted by Nebraskans for Palestine, where organizers called for a ceasefire in Gaza. That particular clip was of Katie Bogan, an activist, doctoral candidate, and poet. Today, she's joining us to talk about Wednesday's press conference. So, Katie, you were one of two opening speakers at the press conference held at the Capitol building on Wednesday, calling for ceasefire in Gaza. Given the front and center nature of the Capitol Rotunda during the legislative sessions, what kind of response or acknowledgement were you hoping for from lawmakers as they were exiting the morning session?
Well, I don't want to speak for my fellow organizers and folks who are involved on the ground, but I know for me that level of visibility is really important to give folks the opportunity to listen, particularly folks who have been so, distracted by other labor or the demands of their work that they haven't carved out the time to stand and listen. And one of the things that was, I think, frustrating about the event the other day is folks did file out into the hall and saw that the press conference was happening and immediately left. And it feels like there's this active decision being made by our representatives and our policymakers to turn off their empathy, to toggle down that sense of compassion so that they don't have to deal with the fact that Nebraska contributes to what's happening in Gaza. We have an arms facility that creates weapons that ship directly to the Israeli occupation force and allows them to police Gaza. So there is a link here between our community, Lincoln, Nebraska, and the suffering that is happening in the Levant. And it's been disheartening to me and disappointing to me to see my representatives refuse to even pause and hear what we have to say and build some compassion in their hearts for the people of Gaza.
And of course, I'm wondering, have you been at all of the protests that have taken place in the last 9-ish months?
I have been at many of the protests, both here and in other states. I travel quite a bit for work, so I attended some of the protests in Seattle. I've been engaged in a lot of online consciousness raising and mobilization efforts. I'm part of the new SJP initiative to try to get a screening of Israelism done at UNL. So there's been a smattering, I would say, of political engagement, both with the group that was at the Rotunda, with some other grassroots organizations across the United States, and with students on campus.
And that's interesting to hear that you are so widespread in your involvement. It's not just Lincoln that you are participating in. And so I guess I'm wondering, did you start off here in Lincoln with this work, or did you start elsewhere and bring it home?
I really started elsewhere. I was actually on a trip to Paris in mid-October, and the violence in Gaza and the genocide was really taking off, and I was seeing the carpet bombing happening of civilian populations in one of the densest populated areas in the world, and I just couldn't not speak about it. And I'm a Jewish woman. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, as were his sisters. I was raised by the son of a Holocaust survivor in a very Zionist household. And it felt important to give people a model, or at least one example, of someone who was raised Zionist and truly did believe for a very long time about the promise that Israel held, and did some of that unlearning work in college and through research and through some of my trauma-focused work, to be able to arrive at a pro-Palestine politic. So I started posting about this when I was in Paris and went shockingly very viral, sort of across the Levant and across the Arab world. And so my videos and my perspective on unlearning Zionism went viral in Egypt before it ever came to Lincoln. So by the time I came back from that trip and was settling back into fall semester, I had garnered quite a rapid following on social media, and some of the organizers here reached out and had seen me speak, knew that I was a poet and a storyteller and had something to say, and asked if I would be willing to help with some of the grassroots movement in Lincoln. And it is so important that we put our labor of love where our communities actually live and where our neighbors actually garner their information. So I've been able to help, I hope, in some small way.
It's interesting how you describe your family and yourself as having grown up with that Zionist ideology, especially because there are folks out there who, because of their support of Palestine, are accused of being anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. And I'm wondering how you, as a person of the Jewish faith, reconcile those two concepts.
Absolutely. So I feel very fortunate and very privileged that my body, my actual physiology, is 2 generations removed from the trauma of the Holocaust rather than one. I acknowledge that conversations about Israel and Palestine are incredibly triggering to the older generation of Jews in the United States, where they might notice as this conversation begins that their hands are beginning to shake, or their face is getting red, or they're starting to sweat. And I work in psychology, and so I'm familiar with some of the literature on epigenetic trauma and the way that trauma inheritance affects our biophysiology. And so when older Jews hear conversations about Palestine, they're experiencing a fight-flight response. They're experiencing a trigger reaction where they genuinely might feel in their bodies like they're about to have to fight a tiger. And when you are priming yourself against a threat, that higher order thinking, where your empathy and your compassion live and your ability to perspective take, particularly among people who you perceive as your adversaries, that is tuned way down. So it's really hard for them to sit in the panic their bodies are experiencing and feel compassion. And the people in my generation have a different latitude to feel that compassion, because when I talk about the liberation of Palestine, when I talk about the development of a single secular state where both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peaceful, collaborative coexistence, there is no panic or fear that happens in my body. I do not sweat. My heart does not begin to race. And that, I think, really is a privilege. And I did have this process as well when I went to college of beginning to unlearn Zionism through some of the courses that I took, that I think also just weren't options for the older generation of my family, because examining Israel as an apartheid case study had not made its way into political science literature or sociology literature in the way that it had by the time I got to higher education. And so I had this Institute of Higher Learning where I went to undergrad, allowing me to imagine Israel, this place that I had always thought of as, the glittering promise of Jewish safety, as something else, and asking me the question, who has to suffer for Israel to be able to be perceived as this glittering safe space, which it is very clearly not. And I was in college from 2011 to 2015, which was right in the middle of this second onslaught of Gaza, the really big military action that Israel took in 2013, 2014 that killed over 2,000 Palestinians in Gaza in a very short amount of time. That happened while I was in school and preparing to go on birthright. So I felt like there was an intellectual responsibility for me to learn as much as I could about what people in Gaza were facing, what Israel's neighbors were facing before I traveled to the region. And by the time I finished my formal education on the politics of the Levant, I was very pro-Palestine.
And one of the things that you spoke about yesterday in your speech, not yesterday, the day before that in your speech, was this idea where you have privilege as an American Jew, and how there is a dichotomy there with some of the ideas that Israel puts forward. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I thought that was so interesting when you were up there talking about it.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to make it so clear, being anti-Zionist or being critical of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic. I think this idea that Jews can only be safe if Israel exists, that to me is deeply anti-Semitic. That makes the claim or the assertion that all of the other governments that have Jewish citizens living in their countries, they don't have a responsibility to maintain Jewish safety because Israel will do it. If Israel exists, then Jews can just go there. It creates this paradigm where we have to assume that we're going to be unsafe if we live external from the land of Israel. And I feel so conflicted about this because there's such an obvious cognitive dissonance to me. How can people say out of both sides of their mouth that I am privileged and safe living in the West because I'm not experiencing this onslaught of threat, which is what people perceive Jews to be under in the state of Israel, and also claim that Israel is the only safe space for me to exist? Both of those things cannot be true, that I am so safe and privileged in the United States, and I do feel relatively safe in the United States, and also that Israel is the only safe place for me to be. This is not to say that anti-Semitism isn't on the rise, because it is. Because every time Israel acts as a global bully and a global aggressor, every time Israel mass murders children, and the state of Israel signs off on the death of pregnant women and assault on people in hospitals and UNRWA shelters and folks who are in desperate need of care, every time Israel brutalizes those people, folks who have been told their entire lives that Israel represents global Jewry associate that kind of violence and brutality and lack of empathy and lack of compassion with Jews, project Israel's cruelty onto us, and react the way that they perceive to be appropriate, which is to punish us for what Israel is doing. I do not feel safe when Israel tries to quote unquote defend itself. That is the time when diaspora Jews and global Jewry are at the highest risk for experiencing anti-Semitic violence. So I think Israel really stands to benefit from this, and the Project of Zionism really stands to benefit from this, because they can say Jews are at risk, and so we must behave as an aggressor, go behave violently and brutally, global anti-Semitism rises, Jews feel unsafe, and then Israel gets to, tuck its hair behind its ears and say, see, you all really need us, which is so manipulative. And it creates this foundation where Israel necessitates violence toward global Jews in order to facilitate the claim that it has to exist. And so there's a really mutually supportive kind of bi-directional symbiosis happening there for the state of Israel, saying the only place that you're safe is here, and we're going to prove it by being so brutal that people are cruel to Jews the world over. It's not helpful for me or my family. It's not helpful for my Jewish community members. It's not helpful for any of the anti-Zionist Israelis who actually have to live in Israel and watch their politicians green light this horrible violence. I think everyone suffers when Israel tries to benefit from this mutuality.
And of course, you called for ceasefire the other day at the protest, and that is an ongoing effort that is happening here in Lincoln. What do you hope is the next step in calling for ceasefire?
Yeah, I would really love for there to be a resolution presented to the legislature. We just saw a huge Midwest city, Chicago, pass a ceasefire resolution just several days ago. And I think that demonstrates one of the most important things that a citizenry can demonstrate, which is public dissent to violence. Our politicians are meant to represent our interests. And we've seen mass movement, the creation of student groups, these boots on the ground protests through the Haymarket at the Capitol, of citizens saying this is not okay with us. And we're asking for this resolution to be put on the table so that the legislature can at least discuss what a ceasefire would mean. What would that mean, even in terms of businesses in Nebraska? If we can't investigate what a ceasefire would mean for our politics at home, then what are we really doing here? Like, what is the purpose of a legislative body who can represent citizens and interface with the business class if they're not willing to do that cognitive work? So I would say my request is that first, the politicians who are turning their ears off and turning their empathy off, please toggle them back on and come listen to us. If you have children and you've seen the horror that the kids in Gaza are facing, and you're not picturing your own child's suffering, the shape of their suffering within your own family, then please, for just a few minutes, do that work and sit with the grief and the fear and the rage that comes up for you, and ask yourself how this onslaught against Gaza could possibly be justifiable. And if you come down on the line of, it is not justifiable, I would never want that to happen to my own family, I would never want that to happen to my own children, then please, as our representatives, do something about it. Pass a ceasefire resolution. Another massive Midwest city just did this. They are representing the needs and the wants of their citizenry, I think in a way that honors everything that democracy is supposed to be about, which is listening to voices of dissent and bringing them into public discourse in a way that honors the highest peak of our humanity and not the depth of sort of how evil we can be to each other. So I would like the peak of humanity from my representatives, please.
And of course, I don't have any other questions this afternoon, but do you have any other comments you'd like to make about the call for ceasefire or the protests the other day?
I would say if you meet a Jewish person in Nebraska, please do not assume that they support the state of Israel. Most of my Jewish peers here are horrified by what Israel has been perpetrating against Gaza and against Palestine. So if you meet us and you're curious of our perspectives, ask the question. We will have conversations with you. And also, I think what's been so striking and beautiful in terms of this grassroots movement in Nebraska has been the interfaith effort, where we have Muslims and Christians and Jews, folks of many different Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic faiths at every protest, which says to me that this is not a single faith or an in-group, out-group debate. This really is a movement that is garnering momentum. And in order for that momentum to do what it is meant to do and liberate people who are suffering, we need our leadership to listen.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to sit down with us and discuss the protest and the call for ceasefire.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
And of course, we have our 30-minute break planned. Once we return, we'll hear from Lori Dance, the opening speaker at Wednesday's press conference, where the Nebraskans for Palestine called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Don't go anywhere, and we'll be right back.
Support for KZUM comes from Lincoln Exposed. The annual showcase of Lincoln music returns in February 2024 from the 7th through the 10th. More than 80 bands will be performing at 4 downtown venues: the Zoo Bar, Duffy's,
the Bourbon Theater, and 1867 Bar. Tickets are available on TicketWeb and linked on bourbontheater.com. More info available for Lincoln Exposed on Facebook and Instagram.
Support for KZUM comes from the Talon Room, presenting the first annual Galentine's Day soiree on Tuesday, February 13th from 5 to 8 p.m., including an evening of food, photo booth, music bingo, crafts, and more. Details and tickets for Galentine's Day at the Talon Room are available at talonroom.com and on Facebook.
And
Lincoln Pharmacy, a local neighborhood pharmacy located at 33rd and A Streets, offering medication therapy management, medical supplies, citywide prescription delivery, vaccinations, and more. Open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. More information at lincoln-rx.com.
The Asian Community and Culture Center has been supporting refugees and immigrants in Lincoln since 1992. With youth programs like Young Men and Women's Leadership Council and Life After High School, and senior programs such as ELL and citizenship classes, there's something for all ages. Located at 144 North 44th Street, Suite A, find more information at lincolnasiancenter.org.
Welcome back to KZUM News. Kitty was not the only speaker at the press conference hosted by Nebraskans for Palestine on January 31st. There were 8 individuals who shared their experiences and concerns regarding the conflict happening between Israel and Palestine. Unfortunately, we don't have time to sit down with all 8 speakers today. However, we do have Lori Dance, the opening speaker from the Wednesday press conference, joining us this afternoon. So, Lori, this might seem like a blunt question, but how did you get involved with the call for ceasefire efforts?
Yeah, and my involvement with the ceasefire efforts, I want to say first that to those persons who have not gotten involved, there's still time for you to do so. It took me decades, really. When I was in college in the 80s, I kept hearing about Palestinian issues, PLO. Quite frankly, I was a student at Georgetown University, and I come from a working class to working poor background. So surviving Georgetown was an act of resistance. But something was always off in the way the story was told. It always seemed very one-sided. It wouldn't be until the 90s that I would actually start not just accepting kind of the U.S. line or the Israeli line. I started doing more reading, and I started reading from multiple sources, and then realized that there was a lot to be known in more complex ways than the statements that people would make. Oh, they've been fighting for 2,000 years. No, actually, maybe since the 1930s and definitely since 1948, right? There's all of this. And some of the people saying this are my own friends, people in my own family. So my kind of coming to this moment has been one of constant reading, constant looking at beyond the propagandistic claims, be they come from Israeli elites or American U.S. elites. And so back in 2008, when there was Operation Cast Lead, as I mentioned when I gave my speech yesterday, that happened on my birthday. And that then started a series of militaristic attacks on Gaza in particular. So I've been a part of kind of in the moments of calling for several ceasefires. This moment right here is unprecedented. The killings have always been problematic, be they Israeli or Palestinian, but the Palestinian deaths, even before this genocidal proportion, were always highly disproportionate to the Israeli deaths, always, in all conflicts. And the Israeli deaths had been mostly military. So I think all of that, especially since Operation Cast Lead and then the other three militaristic attacks that happened before October 7th, 2023, bring me to this moment for calling for a ceasefire. You don't get to have this disproportionate response. I don't care if you think Hamas is the worst thing, then you're protecting Palestinians from that as well. I mean, even if you want to go with that lie that Hamas is the cause of all this, as opposed to this being a reaction to an occupation that's been ongoing since 1948, and it being a more recent reaction to the blockade of Gaza that started temporarily in 2005, 2006, and then was made permanent in 2007, right? So then you want to protect innocent civilians from that. You want to protect women, pregnant women, children, babies, elderly people from that. The same, if you can't accuse Hamas of being callous in that way and then go on to be callous times thousands. That rhetoric is something that's used, has to do, I think, a lot with the way Palestinians have been dehumanized. You know, the constant attempt to link them to ISIS, to link Hamas to ISIS, is to erase that history that I spoke of in my speech yesterday, is to erase the settler colonialism that has occurred.
And of course, you've mentioned the history, and obviously, since October 2023, we've seen an escalation in the conflict that has been widely portrayed on social media. And there have been several protests that have happened since that particular point in time. Have you been involved in all of those calls for ceasefire?
Well, I think Lincoln has had several protests, and I was in the first four. They happened once a week on Fridays, and I was at those first four. I was at maybe two others after the first four, especially the really big one that was organized among Students for Justice in Palestine and Indigo Bridge. I was at, and I only made it to the Capitol portion of that, but I was told that had hundreds, because the others had more like 50, 30, 60, it depended, and maybe had at one point 100, but that one that happened, what is that? Was that early December, the Indigo Bridge one? Yeah. So I have been, and I've been to a city council meeting. I would have liked to have gone to more. I show up as I can, as frequently as I can. I feel it's the least I can do, not the most.
And of course, you mentioned that many of these protests are varying in terms of size, and a lot of them were around 50 people, you said?
Well, some of the early ones, I should not misspeak. By the time I got there, I don't know how many people were there before me. Probably when you account for people who came and went, it was more than that. But the earlier protests, as they got started, they were smaller, but the quality was still very powerful. I mean, the people there were a very diverse group of people. And yes, so I don't want to demean. I'm a qualitative researcher. I often say that the power of one, for better or for worse, can be pregnant with either wonderful potential or horrible potential. Like, the murder of one person is pregnant with horrible potential. One person standing in solidarity and human rights with a group is also something that has wonderful potential. So, yeah, those earlier protests were smaller but consistent, and the persons there were dedicated. And it was wonderful to see a diversity of folk standing in solidarity with Palestinians.
I'm glad you included that nuance for me for folks who come and go throughout the course of those protests. The only reason I wanted to bring up numbers here is I wanted to know if you had thoughts regarding the growth of the movement here locally and whether you were getting more interaction as time goes on, if you feel like there's more awareness here for our community.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think I would like to know because I was in Europe for a month. So there's this like blank period of time where I wasn't able to pay as much attention. But yes, it started smaller and it got larger. I counted at that event where they walked from the Pinnacle Arena to UNL to the Capitol. I counted 170 people by the time they got to the Capitol, and I was told that it was over 300. Over 300. It might have been 400. That somebody told me over 300 at the Pinnacle Arena. So that was very encouraging to see, right? That people, and we need more than that. We need more than that. But, I come from the DC area. Before I came to Nebraska, I was teaching at the University of Maryland. And, at first I didn't appreciate what 300 plus people meant in the Lincoln context, So now I appreciate the quality as well as the quantity of the support. And I think it has grown.
Yeah, unfortunately, Lincoln is just not as big as DC, so.
No.
But I am really interested in seeing that growth pattern because I know, even still looking through social media feeds, that there are people in our community who don't know what's happening or they aren't sure what role a conflict happening in Israel and Palestine could possibly have on people in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the relationship between two places distanced by an ocean and how you feel the movement can help impact that conflict.
Yeah, well, I was one of those people who saw Lincoln as a flyover city and Nebraska as a flyover state. And of course, I feel very differently now that I live here. And I criticize people who call Nebraska and Lincoln the middle of nowhere. I'm like, actually, it's quite different, given where we're located in the center of the country. You can pretty much go anywhere. I mean, you don't have to fly from one coast to the other. And the other thing about Lincoln and other cities in Nebraska is that Lincoln is a refugee relocation city. And in 2016, Nebraska had the reputation of having more refugees per capita than any other state. I believe this was a state statistic and not a city statistic. That's pretty incredible, right? Not in total numbers, but given our overall population. And so this space is becoming more and more cosmopolitan. The university is doing things. Sometimes people are going backward, but the university is also doing things to create a more and more cosmopolitan space. I have taught a study abroad course in Sweden through the University of Nebraska. So I think we are already an international space. That's the first reason I think we should care. And then what happens in different parts of the world affect us because we're such a powerful country. It affects us in the amount of tax dollars that are given out to this or that group, to this or that nation. So we should care for that reason. And we should care that our tax dollars are being spent to support the slaughter of innocent civilians, right? Mostly Palestinian. but also Israeli, but mostly Palestinian right now. And we should care about that. I mean, the civilians, they didn't sign up for this. They didn't join the military, So I think that's why we should care, right? Just a minute. Sorry about that. So I can come up with multiple other reasons as to why we should care, but just that those particular situations here are the growing cosmopolitan nature of the city of the city and of the state. And then we should want students that are graduating from the University of Nebraska who are competing with students graduating anywhere else in the Big Ten. So this type of awareness. And I often tell my students, it's funny, I remember I had a colleague come visit a class and taught about different types of inequities, and then asked the students if they watched Fox News. And several students raised their hands, and this person then said, well, don't. And I let that person have their opinion, but and because they were a guest in my class, so I'm not necessarily, they get to have their opinion. But I came back to the next class and I said, I would have a different recommendation. Don't just watch any news channel. Watch several and ask yourself, what's the twist? Because whether you're talking about BBC, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, Fox, whatever you're talking about, there's going to be a twist. And you want to be aware of that people are putting a twist on the news, right? So I think we should be cautious about and ask questions about what's the twist here? Because there's a lot of twist in the direction of Israeli elites being placed on news stories about Palestinians. And we hear very little from the Palestinians on the ground who are being slaughtered, and those who remain are subsisting in the worst types of humanitarian dehumanization.
And I think that's a really interesting area where social media comes into play here, is we are seeing firsthand from on the ground folks' experiences in Israel/Palestine, in Gaza. And we are now able to see it directly with the advancement of technology. And I've noticed that in the protests, you have been using social media as a tool to help make your point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how you choose types of platform videos to help illustrate the point of what is happening in the conflict?
Yeah. So that's my landline, which hardly ever rings. But of course, it's ringing now. It'll stop in a moment, and so I'll just let it do that.
No problem. You can go ahead and answer whenever you are comfortable. I can't hear it, but I believe you.
Oh, you can't hear it. Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. Okay. Yes. Well, I first start by looking at multiple sources, and there'll be like X, I was going to say Twitter, but I'm trying to be hip. Oh, see, I'm already not hip because I said hip. But I will see things, very short things, and I always look for the source that they came from. I also look for multiple sources of information. I mean, is this coming from Haaretz, which is a fairly progressive Israeli news source? Is it coming from BBC? Is it coming from... So I might start with something that's on Instagram or something that's on X or something that's on Facebook, but I don't trust that. I mean, I don't trust that alone. And I'm a scholar, so I've been trained to be skeptical. But I want to make sure that when I bring the information forth, that I can vouch for the credibility of the information. And then I also myself have been to Palestine. I went there in 2011, and I have been trying to go to Palestine since the probably 2002, 2003. There was an organization called Code Pink. It was a group of women that I think came together for peace and human rights after the war started on Iraq, right? And so I've been trying because I very much wanted to witness. So it's that combination of knowing what I saw, right? Can't tell me I didn't see it. Knowing that there are multiple sources, knowing that typically the least powerful group in the dynamic is going to be the most misrepresented, right? Wherever you're talking, whatever you're talking about in any nation. So being much more suspicious of what the powerful are saying than what the least powerful are saying, but checking sources on all sides. So, and I said all sides because we talk about both sides, but I think we forget the US's presence in this, right? So there's at least three sides. I mean, there's more than that. But yeah, we forget that. So
We do. Like I was saying, we have a lot of people who really think that Lincoln, Nebraska, or even the United States is isolated from things happening around the world, which is why we like to do pieces like this to highlight why our community cares.
yes.
And I wanted to ask, I know I've spoken to Majid before on this subject, and she had mentioned that these protests, you try to choose locations that are high impact for government officials or officials who can help make a difference in this, in how America plays a role in this conflict. And you chose to host this press conference at the legislature, right outside the legislature, just as they were preparing to get out and leave for the day. And can you talk a little bit about how you hoped your presence would influence government officials in that capacity?
Well, that was Nebraskans for Palestine that did that, that organized that. And I actually came late to say yes to that press conference. I guess they tried contacting me the end of last week, but I was at a math conference over the weekend, and it's like the first week of classes, and I didn't know if I was coming or going. So when I finally responded to the person from Nebraskans for Palestine that called me, and they said it was 12 o'clock, and I was like, oh man, I got meetings, but this is important. So that's why they let me speak first. And I want very much to bring the type of credibility that I can bring. I think what was wonderful about the speakers, and this has happened at other events too, is we speak from a variety of backgrounds, right? You had Jewish American speakers speaking from that background, protesting the disrespect for a Palestinian life, right? You have and I'm Black American, and I try to speak from the credibility of knowing what apartheid is like, even though by the time I'm born in the 60s, so I'm born when it exists, when there's still segregation, but by the time I'm kind of coming of age, it's legally not existing, but it still exists. I mean, you can change rules, but behaviors don't change right away. So I guess the two things about me that I would like to matter the most is knowing what it's like to be a people who have been segregated and told that we are not as complexly human as another group of people. So when I'm then in Palestine and I'm seeing this, I'm feeling it too. I mean, I'm feeling it. I'm vibing with it. I'm thinking about my grandmother, as there are Palestinian people right now. It's very personal to me, and I hope that I bring that when I speak. and that people hear that. And then, I'm a scholar. I've been paying attention to Palestine for quite some time, well before I came to UNL. And now I was also the co-director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University in Sweden, and got exposed to a variety of voices on topics like this. Another thing I think that we sometimes don't understand in the US, not just in Lincoln, is the diversity of Arab nations, the diversity of Middle Eastern people. I think there's a lot of confusion. Like people think Iran is the same as Turkey, is the same as Kurdistan, is the same as, Palestine. No, Palestine usually ends up in a different space, but maybe it's the same as people don't get the complexity of the region. So I hope I can bring both that personal angle and then that scholarly angle and then that angle of having been exposed, right?
And of course, I don't have any other questions for you this afternoon, but do you have any last minute statements you would like to make on the press conference or on your call for ceasefire?
Yes. So I think I would like for people to think of some inconvenience they have experienced, or even if it's worse than that, like the inconvenience of I had my roof years ago, I had the roof of my bedroom cave in from the snow, right? That was an accident, but it was a serious inconvenience. To the more serious accidents that happen to us, the things that we didn't ask for, we had nothing to do. I have right now a family member that's incarcerated that shouldn't be. It's been really hard. And I try to use those moments to connect with what's happening in Gaza thousandfold, right? That we can have some compassion for that situation, that we resist. We know anytime you hear all group X is, that's a bigoted statement. We wouldn't want people to say, well, all Americans are, all white Americans are. I mean, all we have to do, I talk about this in my class with my white students, they're like, that's East Coast, that's Northeast, that's California. And yeah, and I do that because, yes, there's great diversity. And so we wouldn't want somebody doing that to us. And we cannot do that to other people. And right now, and I can't think of, I can't even imagine the complexity of the dehumanization on so many levels happening in Gaza right now, where people don't even have access to toilets. I have a chosen son from Gaza, and not having access to toilets, not having access to water, not having access to food, having parents under buildings, having people who themselves are elderly, or having children who are toddlers. And I would hope that we think of that inconvenience that we've experienced and then imagine what it would be like to not just have an inconvenience, but have these multiple dehumanizations. And we don't want that for ourselves, and we shouldn't want that for anybody, especially innocent civilians.
Local calls for a ceasefire in Gaza are ongoing. And as we continue to report on the subject as it develops, I would like to take this opportunity to include an excerpt from our initial coverage of the protest calling for a ceasefire. As a professor with the Department of Political Science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Professor Ari Cohen teaches classes specializing in the Israel-Palestine conflict. He joined us in December to talk about the historical context of the region's conflicts. Time is linear and constant, so obviously we can't put a pin in the exact moment that this conflict started. But if we had to find a beginning point for explaining this conflict to listeners, where would that be?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult question. And the truth is, where you start determines a lot in terms of what people will think about your own position and in terms about the conflict in general. And so, some people will say we should go all the way back to the biblical kingdom. And some people will say, well, let's just start with 1948. And some people will say, why don't we just talk about what's going on now? And those are all, I think, perfectly legitimate ways to think about the history of the history of Israel, the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, between Israel and the Palestinians. So I'm quite open when it comes to thinking about where we should begin. But in terms of what we're experiencing right now, I think it makes sense to begin with the modern state of Israel. And you can certainly, you can look at 1948 and the creation of the state of Israel, but it's probably wise to go back a little bit farther, whether that's to the British Mandate period in the interwar timeframe, or even to the kind of tail end of the Ottoman Empire, the 1800s, late 1800s, the beginning of the kind of Zionist movement that specifically set out Palestine, Ottoman Palestine, as the best possible location for a future Jewish state. Those are all, I think, good places to really dig in.
And that's a lot of options here for us. So I guess to summarize, let's talk about first what Israel is supposed to be for the Judaic community. Can you talk a little bit about the conflict as put into terms between the Judaic community and the Arab community, and how that is impacting our current conflict, or the current conflict?
Yeah, sure. So a few things like that will get us started, I suppose, right? We can start by saying that the desire for a Jewish return to this land is very, very old. It is not a brand new thing that existed just before the creation of the State of Israel or after the Second World War. It's not even as new as the late 1800s with political Zionism and the desire for a nation state. It goes all the way back to Judaism as a community of exiles. So Jews in the diaspora after the destruction of the Second Temple, going all the way back a couple thousand years, have always focused their attention on this part of the world, and in particular on Jerusalem. And so, there are lots of ways to see this, but I always point people to the prayers that the Jews say, whether it's facing Jerusalem in all of their prayers all over the world, whether it's the specific next year in Jerusalem at the Passover Seder. The closing of every annual Passover Seder, there is a focus, there has been a focus on this particular place for the Jewish community in exile for many, many centuries. And with the rise of the kind of movement for self-determination and for statehood, it made obvious sense to focus for the Jewish community, especially the Jewish community in Europe, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to focus their political energies on this area. And of course, when they did so, there were people living there. It wasn't a big empty place, so there's lots of history that points to the movement of peoples. Obviously, this was a desire for Jewish people from around the world to return to a kind of ancestral homeland. And in some ways, there were efforts made, for example, by the Jewish National Fund to purchase land in Ottoman Palestine, and there were a series of waves of immigration that took place. But in each of these, in these cases, there's a recognition that, just as the Jewish people wanted to move back to their homes, there were people who had their homes there at that time. And so what the concept of the state of Israel is straightforwardly to create a Jewish democratic state, right? The concept of Zionism is the notion that there should be a state for the Jewish people, that there are lots of states for lots of other kinds of people, and there should be one for the Jewish people as well. The State of Israel and its founding documents suggests that they should be a pluralistic democracy with equal rights for all of its citizens, and that includes both the current Jewish majority and also the Arab minority. And so those are the kind of political basics, I guess I would say.
Thank you. I appreciate you providing that historical context, especially about the ancestral home and those more religious overtones, as somebody who can't provide that for listeners. So appreciate that. And of course, you mentioned that, we're seeing two groups clash here now as a result of, of these two different groups trying to occupy the same territory. And so this conflict has been escalating for the last 75 years. Can you kind of walk us through how it has escalated as these two different groups have tried to continue occupying the same space?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that I always try to emphasize when I teach this class, when I talk to people, is one of the challenge that we see is that you have two competing groups, as you say, that both have claims to being indigenous, right? It's often, I think, from afar, it's really easy to say, well, you have one indigenous group, that's the Palestinians, and you have one group of settlers, right? And that's the European Jews who came to the Middle East and all of a sudden demanded that this was their home. But in fact, right, what makes this much more complicated is that Jewish people are indigenous to the Middle East. And once you recognize this idea of competing indigeneities, then all of a sudden you have to understand that the only possible way to resolve this is politically. It's a political problem. It's not so simple to say, well, this group is right and this group is obviously wrong. But instead, it's to say, how will we resolve this? Because we have two peoples with competing claims. And, I think that it's not a new problem, right? It's one that, as you say, it's been going on for, at a minimum, 75 years. And, there are certainly, like, when we talk about claims, there are lots of different kinds of claims here, right? So there are, for example, as a result of, let's say, Jewish National Fund purchases in the 1800s and early 1900s, there are land documents, right, that say this land was purchased and is owned by the Jewish community and then by the state of Israel. But you might have the Palestinian Arabs who were living there who said, well, we never sold it, right? It was registered. The land was registered under the Ottoman Empire, and it was sold by people who didn't live on that land. It was sold by other people. So there's a very complicated claim there. You also have, I think, a series of complicated claims that arise from the immediate post-World War II period, where there was, the British were getting ready to leave. They were tired of being the mandatory power in that volatile place, and there was a very straightforward conflict between the British, the Jews, and the Arabs who were all living in this place, and as a result of that conflict, there were all sorts of claims that were generated, right? Not just in 1946, 1947, but through 1948 and 1949, the Israeli War for Independence, where a series of Arab countries attacked Israel right after the Declaration of Independence. That war created a very large refugee problem that is still unresolved today. And There are different kinds of refugees, right? As people, I think, really have to be thinking about. There are people who fled because there was a conflict going on, right? And people who flee a war zone should have a right to return or to be compensated if they can't return. There are people who decided that they would leave and then they could come back after the war once the Arab states had achieved victory against Israel. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Right? So then they couldn't come back. There's not a claim under international law for those people. Right? And then there's a third category, and those are people who were expelled. Right. So and that again generates a claim. Right. So when we think about the origins of the conflict we're experiencing today, we can't forget these various claims that exist from that time period.